The rain was not supposed to come this hard on Kepler Station's outer wetlands. Jonah Hale knew that because the forecast had promised only light atmospheric instability. Instead, black clouds stacked over the alien sky like collapsing towers, and the first wave hit the research outpost with enough force to knock him off his feet. Jonah was a human xenobiologist assigned to first contact observation, not emergency evacuation. The station alarms screamed in 3 languages as floodgates failed one by one. Water poured through corridors that had never known moisture before. He ran toward the lower habitat wing, shouting warnings that echoed uselessly through the metallic halls. That was when he heard a voice answering him, sharp and melodic, unfamiliar yet terrified. It belonged to Lurie. She was the youngest cultural env of the aerolith, a species adapted to thin air and crystalline cities. Her people did not build for water, and neither did she. By the time Jonah reached her chamber, water was already knee-deep. Panels sparked, lights flickered, and the pressure doors refused to close. Lurie stood frozen in the center of the room, her iridescent clothing soaked and heavy. Jonah grabbed her arm without thinking, an action that violated at least 5 diplomatic protocols. She did not pull away, because the station shuddered violently and the floor dropped several centimeters beneath them. They ran together into an emergency lift, but it jammed halfway up the shaft. Water rushed in from below, cold and fast, climbing higher with every second. "This material will pull me under," Lurie said, her translator trembling with static. Jonah realized what she meant as he watched the fabric cling and stiffen, absorbing water like stone. The flooding was not just destroying the station. It was forcing impossible decisions. The lift stopped entirely with a metallic groan. Water surged past Jonah's waist and rose toward his chest. Emergency lighting painted the chamber in red and amber shadows. Jonah kicked open a maintenance panel and cursed softly. No power, no manual override, and no rescue coming soon. Lurie struggled to keep her balance, the weight of her ceremonial garments dragging her down. Her species evolved for gliding air currents, not resisting gravity multiplied by water. "If you keep those on, you will drown," Jonah said, his voice steady despite the panic in his chest. The translator hesitated before repeating his words. Lurie stared at him, confusion and alarm flashing across her bioluminescent markings. Among her people, removing one's outer layers in front of another was a sign of absolute vulnerability. But the water rose higher. Cold stole Jonah's breath as it reached his shoulders. The choice was no longer cultural, it was physical. With shaking hands, Lurie began releasing the clasps of her attire. The fabric loosened and drifted away, heavy pieces sinking instantly. Jonah turned his back, not out of modesty alone, but respect. He stripped off his own soaked jacket and boots, knowing they would pull him down if the lift failed completely. Neither of them spoke, because survival required silence and focus. When Jonah turned back, he saw not embarrassment, but fear in her eyes. Fear of the water, fear of the unknown, fear of the human standing beside her. "I did not expect first contact to be this," she said quietly. Jonah managed a thin smile. "Neither did we." That was when the lift cables snapped. The emergency brakes caught them just short of disaster. The lift slammed to a halt several levels below the surface. Water sloshed violently but stopped rising, trapped by sealed bulkheads. They climbed out through a torn hatch into a service tunnel half filled with water. Jonah moved first, guiding Lurie carefully, mindful of her lighter frame and different balance. In the narrow tunnel, the air was warmer. Steam rose from exposed conduits, creating a fog that blurred edges and softened fear. They rested on a maintenance ledge, soaked, shivering, alive. The silence between them stretched, no longer hostile, but heavy with shared experience. Lurie studied Jonah openly now, her glowing markings dimmed to a calm pattern. "You did not look when you could have," she said. "In my culture, that matters." Jonah nodded, unsure how to respond. "In mine too," he said. As they waited for rescue signals to break through the storm, they talked. About her sky cities and harmonic architecture. About Earth's oceans and storms that lasted for days. The undressing that had once felt like humiliation transformed into something else. A reminder that beneath uniforms, symbols, and species, survival was shared. But complications were still coming. Rescue drones arrived hours later, cutting through flooded accessways. By the time Jonah and Lurie were pulled to safety, half the station was gone. The incident spread quickly through both human and aerolith networks. Images were censored, reports rewritten, but the truth could not be erased. Some aerolith elders claimed Lurie had been dishonored. Some humans accused Jonah of boundary violations. Neither accusation captured what had really happened. Lurie spoke before councils and assemblies. She told them about fear, water, gravity, and trust. She explained that vulnerability did not weaken her, it kept her alive. Jonah submitted reports that emphasized cooperation over protocol. He expected reprimand, maybe worse. Instead, negotiations shifted. Emergency training became shared. Architectural designs changed. The complication was not scandal. It was transformation. Months later, a new station rose above the wetlands, redesigned for both air and water. Jonah and Lurie met again there, fully clothed this time, smiling at the memory they shared. They stood where the floodwaters once surged. A place of loss turned into a foundation. "What we lost that day," Jonah said, "taught us what we needed to keep." Lurie's markings shimmered softly. "Yes," she replied, "and what we needed to remove. Not clothing, but fear, assumptions, and distance." The flood had forced them to undress in the most literal sense. But what followed reshaped two civilizations. And that was the true complication. The storm became legend long before the repairs were finished. Among humans, it was called the Wet Silence. Among the aerolith, it was remembered as the day the sky learned wait. Jonah returned to the rebuilt station not as a researcher, but as a liaison. His role was no longer to observe quietly, but to translate meaning where language failed. That task proved harder than surviving the flood. The aerolith arrived in greater numbers than before. They walked carefully through corridors reinforced against pressure and water. Some looked at Jonah with curiosity, others with quiet judgment. Lurie met him at the central platform. Her ceremonial layers shimmered with new materials designed to shed water instantly. Change had touched her people more deeply than architecture. "You are thinking too loudly," she said, reading his posture the way her kind always did. Jonah exhaled and laughed softly. "I'm wondering whether we actually learned anything." They walked together along the observation bridge. Below them flowed a controlled channel of water, deliberately visible, deliberately present. A reminder rather than a threat. Committees on both sides continued to argue. Some insisted the flood incident should be sealed forever. Others believed it should be taught openly. Lurie had become the center of that debate. Not because she was weak, but because she had spoken honestly. Truth unsettled traditions that depended on distance. Children of her species asked why humans tolerated exposure so easily. Human trainees asked why aerolith rituals treated clothing as identity rather than protection. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Jonah noticed that conflict no longer frightened him. During the flood, fear had been simple and direct. Now it was abstract, layered, political. One evening, alarms sounded again, though this time they were calm and measured. A controlled water release test filled part of the station with rising currents. Observers from both species gathered to watch. Jonah and Lurie stood side by side as the water climbed. No panic, no rushing, only quiet attention. The systems held, the barriers adjusted, and the water receded exactly as planned. Applause followed, though it sounded different between species. Jonah felt a weight lift from his chest that he had not known he carried. Later, alone in the quiet corridor, Lurie spoke more softly. "Some still believe what happened between us was shameful," she said. "They believe survival should never require exposure." Jonah considered that, leaning against the cool metal wall. "On Earth," he said, "we learned long ago that pretending invulnerability gets people killed." Lurie's markings pulsed thoughtfully. "Then perhaps that is why your cities flood less often now," she replied. The complication had never been undressing. It was the realization that protection could become a prison. That modesty without context could become denial. As weeks passed, joint drills became routine. Humans learned how Aerolith balanced airflow and movement. Aerolith learned how humans respected water without fearing it. A new term entered shared language: transitional vulnerability. It described moments where safety required letting go of symbols. Jonah recorded that phrase carefully. He knew historians would argue about it for generations. He also knew arguments meant progress was happening. On the anniversary of the flood, the station lights dimmed. A moment of silence spread through every level. Water flowed gently beneath transparent floors. Lurie removed one outer layer, deliberately and symbolically. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. Jonah did not turn away. Nor did he stare. He simply stood present, understanding the meaning. In that moment, the flood finally ended. Not in memory, but in purpose. Two species stood safer, not because they had built higher walls, but because they had learned when to let them fall. Time did what floods could not. It settled debris into patterns and turned crisis into history. The rebuilt station became a crossroads rather than an outpost. Humans, Aerolith, and newer species passed through its reinforced halls daily. No one called it Kepler Station anymore. It was known simply as Confluence. Jonah aged in that place more than he had on Earth. Not in years, but in perspective. Each negotiation stripped away another assumption he had once considered permanent. The flood was now taught in academies, not as a disaster, but as a case study in adaptive humility. Students debated it fiercely. Some argued that protocol should never bend. Others insisted survival itself rewrote law. Both sides missed the quiet truth that lived between them. Lurie had changed as well. Her role expanded beyond envoy into something undefined but essential. She spoke less about rules and more about thresholds. She described moments where culture must inhale and exhale, where holding too tightly meant breaking. Her words unsettled elders and inspired younger listeners. Jonah often watched those discussions from the edges. He had learned that presence sometimes mattered more than participation, especially after the flood taught him how quickly control vanished. One cycle, a delegation arrived from a water-adapted species known as the peregrine. Their cities floated, breathed, and sank by design. They listened with interest as Confluence shared its history. The peregrine did not judge the undressing incident. They found it unremarkable. To them, exposure was simply physics. That reaction surprised both humans and Aerolith. It revealed how relative shame and pride truly were. Jonah felt something loosen inside him as he observed the exchange. Lurie later remarked that perspective functioned like water. It filled whatever shape it was given, and drowned those who refused to acknowledge it. New emergencies arose over time. Not floods, but fires, pressure failures, atmospheric shifts. Each crisis tested whether lessons had truly been learned. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they were not. Progress, Jonah realized, moved like tides rather than arrows. On a quiet cycle, Jonah and Lurie returned to the lower levels. The exact lift shaft had been preserved behind transparent barriers. Visitors stood there often, silent and reflective. No plaques dramatized the event. No heroic statues stood nearby. Only data readouts and recorded testimony. Lurie placed her hand against the barrier. Her markings dimmed to a contemplative glow. "This place still listens," she said. Jonah nodded, understanding without fully knowing how. Some spaces remembered stress, the way bones remembered breaks. Strength grew differently there. They spoke about futures rarely discussed publicly. About joint colonies where water, air, and gravity varied wildly. About children who would never know a single homeworld. Those children would inherit stories. Not commands. Not prohibitions. The complication that once frightened councils had become guidance. Undressing had ceased to mean loss. It now implied readiness. Jonah noticed language itself evolving. Words once synonymous with shame were redefined as trust markers. Translation software struggled to keep up. That struggle became a symbol of success. When language lagged behind reality, it meant reality was expanding. Years later, when Jonah prepared to leave Confluence, the departure felt heavier than any floodwater. He walked the corridors slowly, memorizing sounds. Lurie accompanied him to the launch platform. No ceremony, no audience. Just shared quiet. "You carried the water with you," she said. "Not on your skin, but in your thinking." Jonah smiled. "I think it carried us both." The shuttle doors closed gently. Thrusters hummed rather than roared. Design choices mattered now. As Jonah lifted away, he looked down at the station. Channels of water shimmered beneath layered structures. Nothing was hidden anymore. The flood had never been the enemy. Resistance without understanding had been. Across species, across years, across mistakes. That truth endured. And wherever Jonah traveled next, wherever Lurie spoke or taught or listened, the water followed, not as destruction, but as memory, as movement, as life.